Have you ever been told to be grateful for leftovers, as if survival was a gift, not a right? Maybe you've walked into rooms that weren't built for you, lowered your voice to fit in, or worked twice as hard for half the recognition. If any of that feels familiar, this story was written with you in mind. It's not about revenge. It's about what happens when the ones who were never given a seat build the table instead. I was never supposed to be seen. Crestwood Heights had a way of erasing people like me without touching them. The houses weren't just big, they were blinding. Windows tall enough to swallow sunlight whole, gates that didn't creak because they were oiled before they ever could, and floors, those marble floors, that whispered wealth with every polished inch. My mother cleaned those floors, and I traced letters on them. While other children played on playgrounds or watched cartoons, I sat cross-legged on cold, glossy marble, sounding out syllables from a worn phonics book. I used to pretend the cracks in the tiles were veins in a giant's hand, and I was learning to read its fate. My mother would hum softly from the next room, mop in one hand, bucket in the other, back aching under the weight of people who'd never know her name. "Keep your head down. Be better than they expect," she'd say whenever she caught me staring too long at a chandelier or a family portrait on the hallway wall. I didn't fully understand what she meant then, but I memorized it anyway, like all the things she whispered while tying on her apron. That apron, I swear it had more hours stitched into it than any clock I've seen since. She would drop me off at school still smelling of lemon-scented bleach. My uniform never quite matched the others. It was always slightly faded, slightly shorter in the sleeves, slightly tighter at the neck, secondhand from a donation bin outside the community center. 5, I'd whisper, flipping my flashcards. Pedigree, merit, entitled, benefactor, tuition. She'd nod. "Which one are we beating tomorrow?" "All of them," I'd say. And she would smile, that soft, tired smile that always seemed to carry both pride and guilt in equal measure. I used to think if I could make her smile longer, she wouldn't have to scrub toilets anymore. That maybe, just maybe, if I became someone, she could finally stop being no one. Sometimes I'd stare at her apron hanging by the back door. It used to be white. Now it was a stained road map of every house she'd ever cleaned. Marble polish, grout cleaner, tea spills, wealth leaves marks just like poverty does. Only theirs can be wiped clean. Ours gets stitched into fabric. I remember the day I first noticed the difference between old money and old effort. I was 10. One of the Crestwood families was throwing a birthday party for their golden retriever. A full event planner, custom bone-shaped cake, a clown, and branded goodie bags for dogs. Mama and I had cleaned the patio the day before. I'd swept up a dozen chewed-up tennis balls while she hosed down the stone. The next morning, they didn't even let us near the backyard. They said our shoes might scuff the slate. The dog had better access than we did. That night, I didn't eat dinner. I just stared at my spelling homework and circled the word entitlement 3 times. Sometimes I wonder how much of me was built in those silent moments, not the loud humiliations, but the ones too quiet to scream over. A closed-off bathroom while I needed to pee. A smirk from a girl in ballet class when my tights had a hole in the ankle. A teacher who called on me only when she needed a hard worker for something no one else wanted to do. Pity was currency. I learned never to touch it. No one taught me how to blend in. They taught me how to outlast. And I did. I studied. Harder. I memorized every textbook I could borrow. I stayed behind after school. I learned the perfect neutral smile that said I belong here without daring anyone to test it. But deep down, I always felt the marble under my feet. I carried it with me. Cold, unforgiving, reflective. You see, I didn't grow up near privilege. I grew up inside it, but only ever as the girl watching it from the corners. The girl behind the apron. The one who knew that some doors didn't stay closed because you lacked the key. They stayed closed because you were never supposed to be inside to begin with. And I made myself a promise. One I etched into my mind like I once traced those letters on the floor. If I can't open the door, I'll build one they can't enter. Getting into Whitmore Academy was supposed to feel like winning. I imagined it would be a moment of triumph. A door flung open, a warm welcome, a place that finally saw me for more than what I wore or where I came from. But the truth? It didn't feel like arrival. It felt like glass, smooth, cold, and utterly transparent, like I'd stepped into a place that wanted me on display, but never to touch anything. Orientation day should have been a beginning. I wore my pressed shirt, the one Mama had ironed the night before like it was armor. She kissed my forehead that morning, whispered, "Show them," and handed me a packed lunch in a brown paper bag that crinkled with every step I took toward the future. And then I heard it. "Oh, look, the scholarship special." Bradford Sterling III, tan loafers without socks, sunglasses tucked into his collar like a crown, a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and friends who laughed a beat too eagerly. I forced a laugh, tight, breathless. "Better than the trust fund discount, right?" he smirked, turned away like I hadn't spoken. I walked to the registrar's table, trying not to clutch my folder too hard. My palms were damp, my back straight. My shoes, faux leather, slightly peeling at the heels, squeaked with every step on the marble floor. That same cursed marble. Always beneath me, always judging. From day one, I was labeled without ink. Not student, not even scholar, just the poor girl who got lucky. The campus itself was a fairy tale designed by architects who'd never had to budget a grocery list. Ivy curled around stone walls like it had been trained to pose. Fountains flowed like status symbols. Even the trees seemed trimmed for aesthetics, not shade. Everything whispered legacy. And I, wrapped in clearance rack blazers and hand-me-down jeans, was a misplaced comma in their sentence. They didn't mock me to my face often. That would have required acknowledgement. No, they were subtler. Their eyes would linger a second too long on my shoes. Their voices would drop half a decibel when they asked, "So, where did you say you went to school before this?" And when I said public, they'd nod, overly polite, as if I'd confessed to something contagious. I sat alone in the cafeteria my first week, surrounded by soft murmurs and the metallic click of designer cutlery on bone-white plates. Across the room, a girl cried over a scratched Birkin bag. I bit into my sandwich, 2 slices of bread holding 3 kinds of silence, and reminded myself why I was here. Not to belong, to escape. So I worked, harder than anyone else. While they skipped lectures to attend mixers and yacht parties, I sat under library fluorescents until my vision blurred. I tutored struggling freshmen in subjects they didn't care about. I volunteered for research that no one else wanted to proofread. I earned perfect grades not out of pride, but necessity. My scholarship came with a GPA leash. 1 slip, and it'd all vanish. Some nimis. "Jeets!" I cried into my pillow so softly the tears barely registered as sound. And then I got up, wiped my face, and studied harder. They drank cocktails. I devoured calculus. They built social portfolios. I built a tutoring program for low-income applicants applying to private schools. I didn't party, I didn't flirt with legacy boys, or linger in the art gallery wings where trust fund kids played at sophistication. I didn't try to fit in, because I knew better. Fitting in meant erasing myself, and I couldn't afford to disappear. When the Sterling Scholar grant applications opened, I saw my chance. It was the most prestigious academic funding on campus, offering not just tuition coverage but stipends, travel grants, and connections to institutions I could only dream of. I met every requirement. GPA 4.0, letters glowing. Research, original and peer-reviewed. Community work, measurable and impactful. Even my personal essay, revised 21 times, read aloud to Mama like gospel, spoke from somewhere raw. I didn't just qualify. I was built for that grant. So I walked into the interview room with my hair pulled back, blazer buttoned to the throat, and a binder full of brilliance. Mr. Sterling, the patriarch, sat across from me, silver-haired and terrifying in his stillness. His eyes skimmed my name. Paused. "Carter," he said slowly. "Ah, the girl from Crestwood's side entrance." My stomach coiled. He didn't read my file, not truly. He flipped through pages like they were grocery receipts. "You're impressive," he said finally, folding his hands. Truly. But we invest in students who reflect our values. I didn't know what to say. I think part of me still believed he'd come around, that merit would finally speak louder than money. You don't quite fit the legacy, he added, with a smile that chilled me more than any insult ever had. Legacy, that word again, not a marker of excellence, but permission. I left the room holding my folder like it might break. I didn't cry, not yet. I just walked back to my dorm, closed the door, and sat on the floor for hours, staring at the essay I thought would change my life. It hadn't even been read. That was the moment it hit me. Whitmore wasn't a new world. It was just Crestwood with better branding, and I was still the girl behind the apron, only now dressed up in borrowed prestige and expected to be grateful for the scraps. I thought I'd made it to the top of the staircase. Turns out it was a display case all along. It started with a sentence, crisp, practiced, delivered like a verdict dressed in courtesy. "You're impressive," Mr. Sterling said, barely lifting his gaze from the polished mahogany desk. "But we invest in students who reflect our values. You don't quite fit the legacy." That one line gutted me more than 100 rejections ever could. Not because it was surprising, but because it confirmed something I'd spent my whole life trying not to believe. I wasn't being judged on merit. I was being measured against a bloodline. I left the Sterling Scholar interview room with a smile frozen on my face. My knuckles were white around the leather handle of my binder. I walked past classmates sipping coffee in velvet armchairs, past the portraits of alumni who shared nothing with me except the ability to breathe. By the time I reached the dorm, my hands were trembling. I didn't tell anyone I'd been rejected, not at first. I just sat on the floor beside my bed, back against the wall, staring at the words, merit-based opportunity pry, punted across the top of the application folder like a joke. My heart wasn't broken, it was insulted. I hadn't expected a trophy. I expected fairness. That was my mistake. And for a few days, I thought that would be the worst of it. The bitter truth, the locked door, the lesson. But then the whispers started. It began with an email, a quiet one. No subject line, no body, just an attachment. Screenshots of my coursework. Copied, they claimed, of a private tutoring session, edited, blurred, taken out of context. A photo of me in the library late at night, annotated to suggest something dishonest. Plagiarism. Cheating. They said I'd stolen code from a former student's thesis, that I'd reused essays, that I'd falsified attendance sheets for my tutoring program. None of it was true, but truth didn't matter in places built on perception. I tried to defend myself. I printed emails, annotated my code in excruciating detail, brought witnesses, dates, timestamps, and still. Due to the overwhelming evidence presented, the disciplinary committee wrote, "We regret to inform you that your enrollment has been terminated effective immediately." The sentence arrived in a PDF. Sterile, formal, no hearing, no meeting, just a verdict I couldn't cross-examine. I remember staring at the letter on my laptop screen, the light casting a pale glow over the cracked linoleum floor of my dorm. My breath was shallow, my vision tunneled. I hadn't even been allowed to speak. Bradford passed me the next morning on the quad. His smirk carved itself into my spine. "You don't get to rewrite your story here," he said, like it was a punchline, like I was a plotline he'd corrected. I stood still, watched him walk away. I didn't scream, didn't cry. I couldn't, because something had snapped. My mentor, Dr. Ellis, the same professor I'd helped win a national grant with my research analysis, refused to respond to my messages. When I visited his office, the door was shut. The light was on. I waited 2 hours. He never opened it. That night, I packed. No ceremony, no suitcase. Just what I could fit in my backpack and 2 tote bags. My sheets were borrowed. My textbooks, returned. My laptop, ancient, chipped, was mine at least. A final gift from Mama after she gave up her winter coat one year to buy it. I folded everything with methodical precision, as if neatness could protect me from the chaos unraveling inside. The walk out of Whitmore felt longer than my entire time there. Each step echoed with the weight of every night I'd spent proving I deserved to be there. And for what? So a Sterling could rewrite my story without consequence? I boarded the bus just after midnight. No one noticed. No one called. No one cared. When I stepped into our apartment, the light above the kitchen flickered. The walls smelled faintly of pine cleaner. Mama looked up from the couch, where she'd fallen asleep folding laundry. She didn't ask questions. She saw my face. She knew. "You did everything right, baby," she whispered, reaching for me. Her hands still smanned, a lead of soap and sorrow. I sat beside her and handed her the neatly folded sheets from my bag. She unfolded them silently, smoothing them across her lap like they were fragile. We didn't speak for hours. The TV played low in the background, a sitcom, laugh tracks mocking my silence. I stared at the wall, at the crack in the paint that curled like a question mark. I thought about everything I'd sacrificed, every missed party, every skipped meal, every night I'd whispered affirmations into the dark, telling myself it would all be worth it. It wasn't. The next morning, I woke up without a plan. My body ached from the bus ride, my eyes heavy from a sleep that offered no rest. My phone was full of notifications from classmates who'd seen the campus email. Some sent pity, some sent silence, but none sent belief. Because belief requires proximity, and people like me are always kept just far enough away to be forgotten when it counts. I looked at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. My face was gaunt, my eyes swollen, my mouth pressed into a line that felt like concrete. "You didn't do anything wrong," I whispered to myself. It didn't help. That was the cruelest part. I had done everything right. And still, the system devoured me whole, because it had never been designed to recognize me as real. That night, as Mama fell asleep on the couch again, this time with my ruined future tucked into her chest, I sat by the window, knees to my chest, watching streetlights flicker. I didn't cry, not because I wasn't broken, but because my tears didn't feel like they would change anything. Sometimes, silence is the only way to scream. 5 years. That's how long it took to stitch myself back together. Not into something glamorous, not into something triumphant, just something functional, something breathing. There was no glow-up montage, no viral success story, no hidden benefactor waiting to swoop in and say, "You've been seen." There was just me, and the rust-colored uniform I wore at the diner, the bleach-stained name tag that always spelled my name Lena instead of Lena, the tutoring center down the street where I explained fractions to 12-year-olds who ate dinner from vending machines, and the community college classes I took online at night, my borrowed laptop flickering like it was gasping for life. My Wi-Fi came from a neighbor's unlocked signal. I used to pray they wouldn't change the password before finals. I lived in a one-room apartment above a dry cleaner. The walls smelled like starch and disappointment. Some nights I couldn't sleep because the pipes moaned like they were grieving too. I wasn't rebuilding. I was surviving. And yet, that was something. After everything Whitmore took, after everything Crestwood whispered about what I wasn't, just being still here was defiance. Most days were numbing routines. Burnt coffee, blistered feet, students who didn't care, customers who snapped their fingers like I was born to serve. But then there were moments, like when a kid I tutored, Jaden, looked up after solving a math problem and said, "This is the first time it didn't feel hard." And I smiled. Not big, not bright, but real. Because I knew how much that sentence cost him to believe. I started building Elevate late one night after a shift. My laptop was overheating, and I had exactly 2 tabs open. One showing overpriced school software with features no one used, and the other showing a spreadsheet of all the things our tutoring center couldn't afford. I didn't plan on building anything revolutionary. I just wanted to fix the stupid interface that crashed every time Jaden tried to submit homework. I wanted a tool that didn't assume every student had a MacBook, private Wi-Fi, and 3 hours of parental help. I taught myself code. Not elegantly, not efficiently. I failed more times than I'd ever admit, but each time something broke, I learned something new. And slowly, Elevate became real. It wasn't sleek, it wasn't branded, but it worked. It tracked progress, gave custom quizzes, had a feedback loop that let teachers flag struggling students early, and it ran on next to nothing. Old hardware, spotty internet, it didn't matter. It was built to survive the conditions that had almost broken me. Within 6 months, a public school 2 cities over started using it. Then another, then a nonprofit reached out asking if they could integrate it into their after-school program. I said yes without even blinking. I wasn't chasing money, I was chasing utility. Teachers emailed me, principals thanked me. I screenshotted every message and saved them in a folder titled Proof of Worth, because somewhere, buried beneath my exhaustion, was still a girl who remembered what it felt like to be told you don't fit the legacy. And yet, old habits die slow. When Whitmore sent out a call for innovation proposals, ideas that could improve access and equity in education, I felt my pulse shift. A part of me, the part that still craved redemption, thought, maybe now, maybe they'll finally listen. I polished the pitch deck like it was scripture. I added testimonials, statistics, comparative analyses. I printed it on thick paper, wore my best secondhand blazer, walked into the boardroom with my shoulders squared. Bradford was there. He was older, sharper in his cruelty. A trustee now, with the same smirk I remembered from orientation. His watch glinted when he flicked his wrist to check the time during my presentation. I kept talking, clear, precise, professional. When I finished, silence hung in the air like fog before a storm. Then he leaned back, tilted his head, and said, "Philanthropy is for people who understand prestige, not desperation." The room didn't gasp. No one intervened. They just nodded, politely, like he'd offered an unfortunate truth that couldn't be helped. I held the folder a little tighter. My fingers ached. "Elevate works," I said quietly. "It's already being used. By real schools, real students." "I'm sure it does," he replied. "But this institution isn't a charity." I thanked them. I smiled. I turned around and walked out without another word. It was raining outside. Of course it was. I stood under the overhang, watching the drops hit the sidewalk in symmetrical patterns. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I just breathed. Because something had shifted. I wasn't the girl behind the apron anymore. I wasn't the scholarship specia. I wasn't even a failed applicant. I was a builder. And what I built didn't require their permission. For the first time in my life, I walked away from a rejection not wondering what I'd done wrong, but marveling at how much they still didn't understand. Prestige had never fed a hungry kid. Legacy had never tutored a student after school. And desperation? Desperation had built something they couldn't even see. That night, I sat on the floor of my apartment, legs folded beneath me, Elevate's dashboard glowing faintly from my laptop. I scrolled through the list of schools using it. 34. 34 schools. I wasn't winning. But I was existing, louder than ever. There was an apron hanging on the hook behind my kitchen door, beige once, but time had dyed it with memory. Grease, polish, bleach, the ghost of lemon-scented floor cleaner. It was my mother's. She used to call it her invisible uniform. "You put this on," she told me once, wringing the fabric between her hands, "and the world stops seeing your face. They see a function." That night, after walking out of Whitmore's boardroom with rejection heavy in my throat and Bradford Sterling's condescension still clinging to my skin, I came home and stood in front of that apron for what felt like hours. It looked small now, too small to hold all the weight it had once carried. But I remembered how her back would bend with it, how her hands would knot it like she was preparing for war. And I realized I'd been fighting the wrong battle. For years, I begged the system to open the door, showed up with numbers, credentials, proof, begged it to see that I was worth a seat at the table. I'd polished myself until I gleamed, only to be told I wasn't the right shape for the reflection they wanted. I thought I was building credibility. I was just building permission. And I was done. "They won't let us in?" I whispered, voice steady even as my heart hammered. "Then let's stop knocking." It wasn't a declaration. It was an agreement. With myself. A quiet signing of terms. I took off the cardigan I'd worn to the pitch meeting and threw it into the laundry pile, pulled my hair out of its clip, kicked off my shoes, sat on the kitchen floor like I used to, knees pulled close, back against the cabinets, and opened my laptop. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I drafted the most dangerous thing I'd ever written, a future that didn't ask for approval. The next morning, I began selling Elevate. Not to a faceless tech giant, not to a profiteer in polished sneakers who would dilute it into some freemium nonsense. I reached out to a nonprofit fund I'd once collaborated with, a tiny group run by educators, not investors, people who knew the difference between engagement metrics and real progress. They made an offer, modest but fair, enough to live, enough to build. I took it, and then I started the Lena Carter Foundation. Not because I wanted my name etched into buildings, but because I wanted every kid who'd ever been told, "You don't quite fit the legacy," to know there was another door, one that stayed open. It wasn't just a scholarship, it was armor. We offered full rides, yes, but we also gave what traditional institutions never accounted for: housing support, mental health counseling, monthly mentorship calls, emergency funds for students who couldn't afford textbooks or therapy or a goddamn winter coat. And we had one filter. One. Each applicant had to have been rejected by an elite institution, not because of grades, but because of who they were, or weren't. No legacy letters, no hidden networks, no family donations tucked between applications. Just proof of effort. I didn't advertise, I didn't host a gala, I didn't call in favors from old professors who never called back. I launched the website with a simple message: this is not charity, this is recognition. If you've been denied for being not quite the right fit, apply anyway. We're not building prestige, we're building proof. Applications trickled in slowly at first. A girl from Detroit who'd ranked #1 in her class but was told her essay lacked polish. A boy from New Mexico who scored a perfect SAT but was asked in an alumni interview if his English was strong enough. A non-binary student whose transcript read like a survival manual, but who was rejected for not aligning with institutional culture. I read every application myself. Some of them made me cry, not because they were tragic, but because they were familiar. They echoed the voice I used to bury. "Please, just let me in. Just see me." The first 6 I chose weren't polished. They weren't smooth talkers. They didn't come with flashy internships or choreographed volunteer hours, but they were brilliant, and bruised, and still trying. That was enough. I flew out to meet them one by one. No fanfare, no team, just me and a rental car and 6 nervous young adults who kept waiting for the catch. Is there a GPA requirement? Will we have to reapply every year? What if we mess up? I told them the truth. You're allowed to struggle. You're allowed to ask for help. The only thing you're not allowed to do is disappear. Because I remembered what it felt like, to fade out of the system quietly. No headlines, no protest, just the silent erasure of someone who never quite belonged. I wouldn't let that happen to them. And somewhere, in the middle of emails and travel receipts and early-stage chaos, I felt it. A pulse I hadn't recognized in years. Not anger, not ambition, something else. Ownership. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to the system. I wasn't trying to be good enough for it. I was building my own. No chandeliers, no dress codes, no smirks behind ivy-covered walls. Just bricks made of stories like mine, mortared together with refusal. I took the apron off the hook that night, folded it carefully, tucked it into a shadow box, and hung it above my desk. It wasn't a symbol of shame anymore. It was blueprint fabric, the one my mother wore to survive, the one I carried forward to design something better. No press release, no press, but I didn't need applause. I needed impact. And the right students? They found me. Because we've always known how to spot doors that were never meant to open and how to build our own without asking permission. The first 6 arrived like shadows, bright ones, but dimmed from too many years of squeezing themselves small. They weren't the kind of students scholarship boards wrote press releases about. They didn't come with portfolios, no polished resumes, no branded extracurriculars, no carefully rehearsed elevator pitches, just stories, heavy ones, scarred ones, real ones. I met each of them in person, not in glass offices, not across boardroom tables, at kitchen counters, local cafes, library study rooms with broken heating and uneven lighting. They showed up in frayed hoodies, borrowed coats, notebooks worn at the spine from use. One girl had a post-it note taped to the back of her phone with affirmations she read before speaking aloud. They didn't believe they belonged, not just in the program, but in the idea of being chosen. "I know I'm not who scholarships are usually for," one of them, Theo, muttered during our first call. "You're exactly who it's for," I said, not a second of hesitation. "We don't build tables just to sit beside those who've always eaten first." Still, it took time. At Orientati, they flinched when praised, shrunk when called smart, apologized after asking for more help on paperwork. I kept every apology they sent. I kept them to remind myself what erasure looks like when it walks on 2 feet and speaks in soft voices. They were brilliant, but starved of recognition. So I fed them something different. I didn't just assign mentors. I became one. I made monthly calls, sent handwritten notes, showed up to their debates, their presentations, even their 3-minute startup demos with clunky audio and lagging Wi-Fi. I remembered birthdays, sent care packages with snacks and fuzzy socks and little things no one ever thinks matter, until they do. One winter, Mari, a computer science student from Arizona, mentioned offhand that the heating in her dorm building was out. She said it like a joke. "I'm surviving. Hoodies are stacking up." That night, I ordered her a winter coat. Nothing fancy, just warm, black, waterproof, durable. She called me 3 days later. She didn't say hello, she just cried. "No one's ever sent me something. Just because," she whispered. "Not even on Christmas." I didn't know what to say, so I said the only thing that came to mind. "You don't have to earn warmth." By year 2, the silence around them began to crack. Zainab, who had once doubted she'd make it past undergrad without burning out, launched a medical nonprofit in Haiti after losing 2 cousins to preventable illness. She ran it out of a borrowed church office and slept 3 hours a night. She didn't ask for applause. She asked for volunteers. Elijah, soft-spoken and sharp as a scalpel, interned with a law firm focused on housing rights. He overturned a discriminatory zoning policy in his home city before he'd even passed the bar. He called me afterward and said, "They listened to me like I mattered. I've never felt that before." I told him, "You didn't feel it. You earned it. Now don't stop." Mari, still wearing the coat, coded a bilingual literacy app that reached over 50,000 downloads in under a year. It wasn't flashy. It was functional. Built for kids like her who grew up in households where reading was a luxury. A school in Sao Paulo emailed her. A librarian in Brooklyn called it a miracle. They didn't brag, they didn't broadcast. But their presence, what they did with the support, spoke louder than any trust fund resume ever could. Their success was quiet, but seismic. I watched them bloom like vines climbing walls that were never meant to hold beauty. The foundation remained small, by design. I didn't want to scale until it blurred. I wanted to remember every name, every story. We weren't building numbers, we were restoring narratives. Sometimes I'd scroll through the database of applicants late at night, rereading essays I couldn't forget. The boy who'd translated for his immigrant parents through eviction court. The girl who started teaching coding to her classmates because her school didn't offer tech electives. The non-binary student whose file was flaggy. D by 3 private colleges for cultural misalignment. Every rejection letter they had received had the same tone, polite, polished, dismissive. Mine didn't. "We believe in what you do, not where you come from. You're not the exception. You're the reason we exist. I didn't build this to compete with places like Whitmore. I built it so students wouldn't need places like Whitmore to become who they already were. Still, it haunted me sometimes, how close they all came to being forgotten. If my inbox had been full that day, if their courage had faltered, if they'd believed, even for a second longer, that the rejection was their fault. Because that's the true damage of elitism, not that it keeps people out, but that it teaches them to lock the door from the inside. So I taught them how to unlock themselves. And in doing so, I remembered how to unlock me. I wasn't healed. I wasn't whole. But I was, for the first time, certain. We didn't need a spotlight. We had our own fire. It came through on a Tuesday, just another file in a sea of applicants. The folder name was Bradley S. Forth. I didn't flinch. Not at first. I read files like people skim headlines now, quick, efficient, scanning for truth between the lines. His application was dull, predictable. Every sentence sanded down into politeness, every bullet point carefully padded with words like initiative and collaboration. The kind of application designed to impress no one, but offend no one either. His essays were weak. All surface, no soul. I've always been passionate about helping others, he wrote, as demonstrated by my work with our local food bank. The food bank in question turned out to be a single afternoon of passing out granola bars during a school holiday drive. There was a photo attached, him in a Patagonia vest, squinting at the camera like he didn't want to be seen there. His volunteer hours were the bare minimum. His extracurriculars were a collage of access, tennis club, yacht internships, policy fellow at his uncle's consulting firm. The letter of recommendation was clearly templated, with his name inserted over what had probably once said Jonathan or Miles. It didn't register until the team flagged it. "This file's inauthentic," my assistant said. "It feels assembled, not lived. And," she hesitated, tapping the screen, "look at the name. Bradley Sterling IV. The IV sat there like a thorn, small but sharp. And suddenly, I could feel it. His voice, from orientation day at Whitmore. "Oh, look, the scholarship special." My fingers froze over the keyboard. Bradford. Bradford Sterling III's son, or grandson, or clone, it didn't matter. Same name, same blood, same hollow certainty that the world would shape itself around him. He had applied. Here. I reread the file, slower this time. It wasn't personal. That was the rule. That had always been the rule. Applications were scored anonymously, names stripped, numbers randomized. But this one, it made its way to me not because of who he was, but because the system flagged his entire package as lacking depth. He wasn't rejected for being a Sterling. He was rejected for being unremarkable. It wasn't even close. No one in the office knew. Not until later. And I didn't tell them. Because I didn't need to. Because it wasn't about revenge. It was about alignment. The scholarship was built for students who had been rejected for being too real. He had been rejected for being too rehearsed. Days passed. I didn't think about it much after that. I had check-ins with Shay, Ulars, budget meetings, a virtual panel with an NGO in Nepal. Real work, important work. Work that fed something deeper than applause. And then the story broke. Scholarship founder rejects elite heir who mocked her. The headline was everywhere. Digital tabloids, education blogs, social media screenshots with red circles and arrows pointing at my face like I'd thrown a punch. Someone had leaked the rejection, and someone else, probably someone in the Sterling camp trying to regain footing, had confirmed it. Suddenly, I was a story. Talk shows wanted interviews. Podcasters requested guest appearances. Op-eds dissected my silent triumph. Think pieces with titles like From Janitor's Daughter to Judge of Legacy, Lena Carter's Full Circle Moment started to flood my inbox. I declined them all. I didn't want a mic. I wanted silence. Not the kind that erases, but the kind that settles after impact. "Will you make a statement?" one of my board members asked. I said no. What was there to say? The boy whose name once closed doors on me had now come knocking. And not even because he believed in the cause, but because he believed he was entitled to a piece of it. Because the landscape had changed. Because his family name had begun to rot in the public eye, and he wanted to tether himself to something clean. He didn't know what this foundation was. He thought it was a scholarship with PR value. He didn't understand that it was a reclamation project, not a charity, not a spotlight, a shelter, a defiance, a truth. I stared at the headlines for a while, not angry, not smug, just still. Because the system that once discarded me had circled back in the form of a question, "Will you open the door for us now?" And I had already answered. No, not out of spite, out of clarity. That was the difference. Vengeance wants to be seen. Justice just needs to exist. That night, I sat at my desk with the apron still framed above me. I sipped tea that had gone cold and read 3 new applications. One from a boy in a foster home who coded his school's attendance software from scratch. One from a girl who learned English by translating government forms for her parents. One from a non-binary student who taught poetry in juvenile detention. I didn't think of the Sterlings again. Because I was too busy investing in stories the world had already tried to forget. And as for the media, let them write what they want. I wasn't here to gloat. I was here to repair. The ballroom wasn't grand, not in the way Whitmore had been, with its chandeliers and champagne and nameplate seating. This one had folding chairs and secondhand string lights borrowed from a community theater troupe that had shut down last winter. And yet, it glowed. 10 years. That's how long it had been since I'd walked away from the system that discarded me. 10 years since I'd decided to stop knocking on the door and start laying bricks of my own. The Lena Carter Foundation's 10-year gala wasn't meant to be a spectacle. We never intended to host one at all. But the scholars, my scholars, insisted. They wanted to celebrate. Not me, they said. Us. I sat near the back, away from the stage. My name was on the program, sure, but I didn't want attention. I just wanted to watch. The 100th scholar, Amani, stood at the mic. 17 years old, braids slicked into a tight bun. Her father drove sanitation trucks for the city. Her mother cleaned offices at night and still made every parent-teacher conference wit. It's 2 hours of sleep. Amani cleared her throat once. Then again, the room hushed. "I was told people like me should be grateful for leftovers," she began, voice even, eyes glassy. Grateful when the world tosses us a crumb of opportunity and expects us to say thank you with our heads bowed. She paused, let that sentence sit in the air like a challenge. But Miss Carter didn't give us scraps. She built us a table. The applause was instant. But I didn't clap. I couldn't. My hands were already moving to the inside of my bag where the fabric waited. I pulled out the apron, folded, clean, stained in places that would never wash out, no matter how many times I'd tried. Mama's apron, my blueprint. I didn't carry it out of pain anymore. I carried it because it reminded me what foundations really looked like. Not polished wood, not perfect angles, but wear, and effort, and care pressed into fabric thread by thread. My eyes blurred, not with sadness, with stillness. Amani kept speaking. She talked about growing up without Wi-Fi, about borrowing laptops from her neighbors, about how her acceptance letter from the foundation made her feel real. For the first time, I didn't feel like an exception, she said. I felt like a reason. The room stood to applaud, not out of obligation, out of recognition. And me? I stayed seated. Not because I wasn't proud, but because I didn't need to be seen anymore. For so long, I had lived with the ache of invisibility, first in marble mansions, then in ivy-covered halls. I fought to be seen, then fought harder to be believed. I wore ambition like armor, wielded success like a shield, mistaking proximity to power for proof of worth. But this this quiet, defiant joy, wasn't proximity. It was ownership. They mocked me for being poor. They called me a scholarship case, a charity case, a cautionary tale. They crafted systems designed to exclude and told me to be grateful when they allowed me to exist in the margins. And now? They study the frameworks I built. They quote our scholar outcomes in education panels, cite our models in grant proposals, invite me to boardrooms where I now decline the seat. Not to make a point, but because I'm busy at my own table. Amani stepped off the stage. She walked to me, eyes still gleaming, and whispered, "Someday, I want to do Hatch you did." I smiled, smoothed the edge of the apron folded on my lap. "No," I said softly. "You'll do more. I just cleared a path. You'll build a city." Because that's the secret they never taught us. Power doesn't come from inheritance. It comes from intention. From knowing who you are before the world defines you. From refusing to let rejection become identity. From taking the scraps they gave you and turning them into blueprints. The foundation didn't make headlines. It didn't need to. Because my scholars, they don't just fit in rooms anymore. They define them. They carry their stories into courtrooms, classrooms, labs, and policy circles, not as shame, but as signal. A signal that the future won't be inherited. It'll be built. One rejection at a time, one restored student at a time, one table, wide enough to seat everyone they said never belonged. What if the greatest power isn't in breaking into their world, but in building your own? Lena's story isn't just about beating the system. It's about redefining worth without waiting for permission. Because real legacy isn't inherited, it's forged by those bold enough to say, enough. So tell me in the comments, have you ever been rejected not for your ability, but for your background? And more importantly, what did you do with it? If this story moved you, hit subscribe, like, and share it with someone who's still knocking on doors that were never meant to open. Let's keep building rooms that stay open,